Howdy YouTube, and welcome to this episode of the Gunman. So this video here is part 1 of the spot repair on this HQ Monaro. This is going to be a 3-part video series. The first video here is going to be prep work and color matching. Second video is going to go through the masking stage, and the third one will be application of the paint. So the way we're going to go about this job is to keep it as small as possible and not paint above those lines, or the swage lines, the body lines that you can see that run down the sides of the car. So the first step was obviously to just remove that indicator up the back there, and next up I'm giving it a really good clean down with some wax and grease remover. A lot of these car nuts, people that have these nice old cars, they like to make their cars looking really nice, and in doing that they probably use some of the silicone based tire cleaners and tire shines and all that kind of stuff. So this car here, while it was clean, it was just a little bit oily, and you could sort of feel this greasiness to it. So rather than usually, like my standard prep work on a standard car would be to clean the panels down with water and methylated spirits, a mixture of that, and that will get rid of any dirt. As it turned out on this job, I didn't really have any dirt on there. It was more just that silicone-y, oily base contaminant that I had there. So I cleaned all that off, and it turns out that I ended up doing that again and again because I knew that there was a possibility of having some silicone or fish eyes come up when I did go and do the paint work. So yeah, that's pretty important when you're working on cars, is to identify any possible issues early on, and that way, as long as you know about it, you can put the measures into place to hopefully eliminate any risk of that happening. So obviously I've cleaned the entire panels down. I've then got some masking tape to just tape off the areas where I don't want to sand. So I've taped up the tops of those lines and also the door area there too. So there's a few extra little repairs here. So the night before starting to work on this car, I had actually already got a little bit of primer. There was a couple of scratches down the side. I think it's my boss's friend's car, this, and he said the owner's wife accidentally put a couple of scratches down the side of it. So not a massive deal, nothing that we can't fix without too many dramas at all. But as far as this little repair here goes, I didn't even see that, and I wasn't told about it until the next day when I actually had a bit more of a look over the car and I was ready to paint it. So I ended up putting a bit of 2-pack filler in there, just some fine filler, and giving it a bit of a block out, as you can see here. As it turns out, I actually didn't even end up 2-pack priming that. I put a light bit of some wash primer over there, and I was able to seal it all down with some 222S, and I'll take you guys through that, as I mentioned before, in the third video. But for now, we just focused on our prep work. So as it turns out, up underneath that wheel arch, there was a few more stone chips, and right down the bottom there's a few stone chips as well. So I just decided to give it a quick scuff by hand and get a little bit more of that fine filler, put it on, and give it a bit of a sand out as well. So you may notice also that I did have the infrared curing lights on it. One thing that my boss said that he was a little bit worried about because I filled up that scratch was possible shrink back down the line. So I said, don't worry, don't stress about it. I'll make sure I get the heat lights onto it to make sure that any shrink back is going to happen before I block it and before I paint it, rather than having it happen a couple of weeks down the track. You've obviously got to be careful with those heat lights that you don't go too close or get it too hot. You can actually get yourself a digital thermometer infrared light on it for about $15 to $20 from eBay. I've seen them. So yeah, I've found over the years I've pushed the limits a few times just on some test panels, and you really don't want to go much above 100. I think from memory the top I ever got without ruining it was 110 degrees. So I wouldn't recommend going that high, but anything up to 100 you're usually pretty right. That's on metal areas. Obviously be careful of any plastic areas. I've actually melted a tail light or two over the years when I wasn't being careful, and if you ever do have to put the infrared lights on an area where the tail light is, just put a piece of masking paper over the top of the tail light, and the paper will be a good insulator. So obviously, as you see here, I've just mixed up some 2-pack fine filler and applied it into those chips and scratches down the bottom of the quarter panel. Again, I've put the lights on that just to help dry it out. I've obviously cut out a lot of that footage. It would have been pretty boring. So I decided on this job here, I got it in nice and fine enough that I wouldn't actually even need to block it out. Plus it's kind of a bit of a freebie anyway. It's just something that I decided to do. The car's here, no use in going and painting over all those chips and scratches, just gonna look terrible. For the sake of 10 minutes worth of work, may as well fix them up. I always do that, especially if it's not going to ruin your blend. If it was right up the other end where I needed to do my blend, I might have just left them and maybe done a touch up over them or something like that. But yeah, where possible, obviously best off fixing what damage you can. I'm just going over those areas there with some 400 grit at the moment, just to make sure I get rid of those deeper 320 scratches that I left before. And I'll be finishing it off with the final grade of 800 grit. So being that I did know that it was going to cut through fairly quickly, that's why I did decide to use the 800 grit on this one. I could have used 600 grit and it's still fine to blend and clear over, but just being that the 800 grit is that little bit finer, less chance of cutting through and ruining your blend. So obviously when you're doing your dry sanding, yep, I'll say it again, keep it clean in between every single stage. Give your Wizzy or your orbital sander a blowout, give your panel a blow off, and obviously inspecting. You know, there was probably about 4 occasions that I even put fine filler in this car. I kept sanding, I found another little chip. It's not a big deal, but as long as you are happy with the end results, and in this case I was. Boss was happy with it, and most of the guys around the workshop said, no, you did a good job on that one, and you'll get to have a look at the car when it's finished, or when it's 90% finished at the end of this video. I actually haven't polished it up yet, so maybe I might be able to squeeze some of that footage in for a 4th video, but we'll see how we go. A job like this, the boss is never really too fussed, and he would probably prefer you to do the polishing yourself. We do have a buff guy, but yeah, that's just for your standard everyday jobs. A job like this, we really want to make sure it's perfect. Boss is like, nah, go out there, you know, spend an hour on it and make sure the polishing stage is done 100%. So maybe I will end up getting some footage of that. As I said before, just using 800 grit, and I'm using the interface pad. I had a guy asking about whether or not you should be using the interface pad and when to use it. I actually find 90% of the time I do use the interface pad. I never used to, but these days I find that, yeah, you're better off using it. As long as you've blocked the panel prior, I find less chance of actually cutting through, because it's going to obviously shape itself to the panel. And as long as you have blocked those primed areas first, it's not going to be a big deal. The main time that I would actually use the hard pad would be if I'm doing a repair, say on a bumper bar, and I don't want to actually have to block it. I'd rip the interface pad off, do the repair with the hard pad, using it as a block, prime it up and continue on with the job. But most of the time I will use the block, and then possibly sometimes go over the top of that with the orbital sander and the interface pad. So that's my take on the interface pad. Everyone's got a different way of doing things. That's just my personal way of doing it. I've found that it works for me, but whatever works for you at the end of the day. And as you'll probably notice here, I'm sanding a bit of it out, running my hand over it to make sure that there aren't any highs and lows. 90% of the time I can feel them with a flat palm. Need be, as I've mentioned in a couple of other videos, you can get some wax and grease remover and give it a wet check. So the wax and grease remover will give the panel the sort of the gloss and the sheen as if it was painted. You can get your eye up on the side of the panel and decide whether or not you need to give it a bit of a block or a prime or whatever. So now we're on to the color matching stage, something that will take years and years of practice, and even after that there's still no definite answer that you will get all your colors right. I actually did 2 reworks last week due to poor colors, just a bad judgment call at the time. I'm not going to blame it on anything. It was my fault. I stuffed up, and yeah, at the end of the day, you just got to, you know, do your best not to lose too much confidence, because a lot of color matching is confidence and looking at a color and saying, yep, that's what I think it needs, or yep, that's going to be good enough, or no, that needs a little bit of matching. So what I'm doing here is completely formulating my own color. Well, I'm not technically formulating it, I'm actually just bench mixing it. So I'm just grabbing a bit of this silver, a bit of that silver, putting them together, and as it turns out at the moment, what I'm doing is actually just sort of choosing the flake, the right silver. I got a couple of the fine silvers. It actually turned out that most of the fine silvers were still actually a little bit too coarse, so I ended up going 595, which is the extra fine metallic. I needed to put a couple of the other fine silvers in it as well. Then I got it to a point where I thought it was good enough off the stick, and I did end up doing a couple of spray outs, making a few minor adjustments, getting the boss down, asking the other guys, what do you think of this? You know, would you run with it, or would you tweak it a little bit? Yeah, some of the metallics can be a little bit of a trick because they look good on one angle, but they look totally wrong on the other angle. So you got to know sort of when to go and when to not go. Like you might look at this color later on, because I'll give you a look at the spray out. You might look at that and say, oh no, that's too dark or it's too light. But as it turns out with this one, the color looks really good when it's on the car, and short of actually knowing that this job had been done, you probably wouldn't really pick it. And that's what our job is at the end of the day, to make it so that you wouldn't even know that the car has been repaired or refinished. Stick matching is something that you can do with solvent, but with the waterborne paints that I use, you wouldn't be able to do it because it changes way too much from wet to dry. You actually can stick match with solvent and then spray it. Like if you're really confident with your stick matching, you actually don't necessarily even need to spray it out. Most of the time I do spray my colors out just to be sure, but yeah, there are certain occasions on certain darker colors I'm just like, you know what, that's gonna be fine, I'm just gonna paint it without pissing around doing spray out cards and all that, waiting for it to dry. Not that it's a real big issue now that I'm on solvent anyway, but yeah, it's just an extra stage that you can cut out of the job. So as you can see here, I've got it to a point where I'm fairly happy with it. I decided to put a bit of thinners in it, and as you see here, I'm not even measuring that out at a specific 2-to-1 ratio. Yes, it's meant to be 2-to-1, but I find that I like to leave them a little bit thicker sometimes. That gives me a little bit better coverage, but with the finer metallics, you shouldn't have too many coverage issues. With the larger flake metallics in solvents, yes, you may have some, poor coverage issues, because I think that they put a little bit extra binder in there for the larger flake size for some reason. It must help them disperse a little bit nicer when you go to spraying it. But a good way around that is to actually just grab some fine silver metallic and use that as a ground coat. So just grab your extra fine metallic, whack a coat of that down first. It should cover just about like a solid color, and then continue on with your top coat color. So a few little things like that you can do with solvent, and you may have noticed on the bench, and you were probably thinking, geez, that's an absolute mess. But no, all that paint does get used, and if I'm doing a larger job or something like that, I'll just grab a few of these colors, mix them together, and say, hey, here we go, there's my ground coat. We're going to be using minimal top coat. Save the boss a couple of bucks. Nothing wrong with that. No one will be complaining about that, will they? Especially the boss. So first up here, it needed a bit of blue and it needed a bit of black. So, the flake size was right, and that was the main thing I was looking at because I did do a bench mix myself. So I spectroed this car, typed in Holden, and the readings was pretty average. It was like 80% match, and I'm like, yeah, it's going to pick the wrong flake size for me, and it's going to take longer to match than if I had have just started from scratch myself. It is times like this when I do miss the Glazeret Profi system. I think it's probably pretty superior to just about any other color matching system. You got all these spectro photometers and all these snazzy things, but you just can't beat the good old color cards of Glazeret. 95% of the time or more, they would replicate if that color looks perfect off that color card. As long as you mix it up without overdosing in any of the colors, you should have yourself a really good color sitting there. But with the system I'm using at the moment, you're really forced to rely on that spectro, and it's not foolproof. Sometimes you just know, no, I'm not even going to mix that color up. I'll just start from scratch myself. And that's actually the case with a lot of the blacks with standox. They're just absolutely atrocious, and yeah, it gets a little bit tiring sometimes when you know that there's better systems out there. It's still good paint. You can't really complain too much about using standox because there's some really average systems out there compared to standox. But yeah, just like any system, they've got their flaws. I also know that Axalta, who own the standox solvent range, don't really seem to put much R&D, if any, into their solvent range. Okay, they'll do a few updates and add the new colors, but they also do know that there's some certain problem tinters. I don't think they care because they're like, you know what, water's out now, water's the new thing, everyone should be going towards water, but not everyone has it. Yeah, we're just sort of stuck with it, I guess. Not a big deal. It's just something that you've got to learn how to, know how to color match if you really want to be using this system successfully, because just about every color needs matching off the machine. Very rare that you get a color that is perfect. It does happen, but out of the 20 to 25 cars you do a week, you might only have 4 or 5 of them that are actually perfect off the machine. I'm actually going to start building myself a bit of a color library with standox, which will probably help out mainly with the 3 stages and stuff like that, and any colors that are good off the machine or perfect off the machine, I'll just put them aside and save myself from having to do a spray out next time. So this ended up being the color that I decided to go with. You can see on certain angles it looks a little bit light, on another angle it goes dark. So what I did was put it over the swage line like that, and it goes dark on one angle, light on the other. That's usually when I paint it. As long as they're not flipping off their brain too much, usually pretty safe. So we've also got that body line. It's working in our advantage because no matter what color, even if you paint them both at exactly the same time, the natural angle of the panel is going to create that flip anyway. So if anything, with the silvers, you're better off being a touch light than a touch too dark. It's really going to stand out if it's too dark, whereas if it's touch on the light side, you'll usually, most of the time, get away with it. Obviously, as long as it's not way too light, then it's just going to stand out as well. So obviously, just giving it another wipe down with some wax and grease remover. As I mentioned before, I knew that this car was going to be a possible problem, so yeah, wax and grease remover as many times as possible. You know, just if you're not sure, do it again, and get a new rag, because even if there was a bit of silicone in that rag picked up, you could end up just spreading it around. So do it a couple of times, can't hurt. This is something that they probably won't show you at school or have in the how-to books. Removing a little bit of fine filler with a razor blade. There's nothing wrong with it as long as you're careful with it. It's not too much unlike shaving down a run. So I just didn't feel like getting a block with 320 or 400 or whatever it be and then having to remove those deeper scratches. I just shaved it out with the razor blade, got a piece of 800 by hand, scuffed off any of those last little scratches that might have been left behind, and that was good to paint over. Next up, I'm giving the underside of the wheel arches a really good clean down, because again, they are just covered in all of that black tire shine. I actually ended up doing this like 3 times, and still when I went to paint it, those bits of tape that I had backmasked under there just started to go loose. Not really a big deal, but I do always like to properly backmask those wheel arches when I'm painting a quarter panel or a guard. That way it's going to stop overspray landing on the undercarriage of the car, and also going to keep any debris and dust and crap from flying into your paint job. So that's about it for part 1, guys. Stay tuned for episode 2, and we'll go right through the entire masking stage. Now you've seen this video, get out there and paint something. Thanks for watching, and this has been another Gunman production. Goodbye.